Perspiration had started to run down his cheeks at the thought of it. His face and body showed how thrilled he was to come up with such a pitch. "I don't wanna, I have work to get done upstairs," Lenny cried towards him, putting his hands above his head, wanting nothing to do with anything that might upset their father, especially in the garage. Martin gawked at him again. "Okay, be a brother, you know how much I love you, Len, I'd do anything for you, wouldn't I? Let's at least play for a little while, then you can go back to whatever it is you do up there in your room," he answered back, hoping to persuade him. He took a deep breath, nodding at him. "You win, Mart, but only for a few minutes. I really don't want to miss out on the contest. Mrs. Pates told me earlier this afternoon that she believes I could win this, and I don't want to let her down." His brother complied, walking sluggishly over to the car sitting high on a couple of red-painted jack stands. The front end of the car was raised on them, the back was level with the ground. "Blah fucking blah, Art, Lenny, get a grip, man, you're a mechanic now. Crawl underneath there and get that busted muffler checked out. While you at it, do a oil change and check them ball joints out," he said, hurrying him to get under. "Come on, customers are waiting, they want their cars done and ready for the road," he hollered, pushing his brother underneath. "And don't you come out until I say. I'm playing the part of both the customer and the head mechanic, so no bullying your way out of this," he said, slightly kicking his brother as he got against the ground. He suddenly slid underneath against his back, and acted as if he was tinkering. "That's a good mechanic, make sure you get the springs and the oil plug looked at, oh and don't forget to adjust the timing belt," he cried from above, jumping into the driver's seat. "Keep it up, we can have this beauty on the road for Mr. Hughes by this afternoon, maybe sooner," he said. Underneath, Lenny continued his best impersonation of an automobile mechanic. "I'm on it, I have the socket on it now, just gotta loosen a few more things and we can pull her out, boss," he hollered from below. His hands were on the muffler as he tapped it using his fingers, making it sound as if something was happening. His brother was above, rocking frantically in the driver's seat. "Get that axle greased and make sure the bearings are good," he shouted, rolling the window down beside him. He put his head out to see his brother's legs sticking out from underneath. "The shocks feel unstable too, it's mighty shaky up here, get that done and don't come out until I say, you hear me?" he hollered again, as he bounced from above, using all of his weight against the inside, rocking it, until the car convulsed from above. Lenny remained underneath, and wasn't aware of his brother's foolery. He was still abiding to his brother's wishes, pattering away against the steel nuts and bolts. "I think we're done, we can get here out now," he shouted, ready to put a close to his brother's amusement. Martin continued swaying the heavy car against the stands, peering at him from above. "Don't you fucking move, you get that brake line and that thermostat done, this car isn't even close, you move and I'll give you something to cry about, Len," he howled, jerking the car side to side. He was now standing halfway on the seat and hanging out the window, almost as if awaiting his smaller brother to come out beforehand. "You keep that fucking head of yours on your work, you hear me? This car is running like shit, and you better fix it up," he squawked once again, sounding angered. Frustration was building on his face. "I'll tell you when the bitch is fixed, this car is not even close, rat boy," he wailed, pushing all of his frame into the upper half of the heavy automobile. It was now reeling against the jacks, as they oscillated uncontrollably. "Don't you fucking get up until that radiator leak's patched up," he wailed, panting from above. Martin suddenly acknowledged the stands in front of him, just inches from his head. "Mart, calm down up there, you have the stands lurching out, don't move around up there so much." He yelled for him to hear him, but he remained above, pouncing against the metal. "Do you hear me? You have to stop moving," he squealed, finally resting his hands at his sides. "You move and I'll kill you myself," bellowed his elder brother. Immediately, the stand on his far left broke loose, flinging the mighty Lancer from it. The wheel began to descend towards him. "Watch it," he wailed in horror of being crushed to death. The car buckled against the steel stands. Without hesitation, he flung himself out from underneath it. He somehow escaped death as he rolled onto the cement not far from the falling car. The jack stand simultaneously exploding out, free from the tires, sending the car slamming onto the ground, barely missing him. "You no good backstabber, you tried to kill me," he shouted, amazed at still being alive, peering at his brother, now standing on the roof of it. He was cringing, unimpressed, and mute. The impact of the fall had dented the room, as he stood uncaring. "If I were to kill my only brother, it would be way worse than this, pussy," his brother said, sly, unremorseful, standing tall above. His face was saturated and his shirt was hanging open. "Mart, you can say hello to the devil when you see him," Lenny replied, walking away through the doorway into the kitchen. He entered his bedroom, wordless, not thinking much more of it. His young mind was on other things than his brother's manipulative ways. He laid once again, along the bed where his art awaited him. Taking a ruby red-colored pencil from its packaging, he instantly forgotten about the whole ordeal that had strangely taken place in his father's so-called study space, his garage, the only area where a man of his magnitude could get away from everyday life. He began to sketch, concentrating on the character he had developed no more than an hour before. Shading and then smearing it using his fingers, until the picture became lifelike and almost reflected everything he had hoped for. His eyes were perceiving it, taking in every aspect of it, as he turned onto his back. He held the artwork above him, immediately sensing someone watching from in the doorway. His eyes caught it the moment it passed by, the vision of someone vanishing before his eyes, in tune that very second, there one moment and gone the next. He studied the door and back to his work, laying his mind where he felt most at ease. Again, he felt that peculiar feeling of someone watching. He glanced up and this time it was his phlegmatic brother. He stood against the door frame, with his hands burning of rage. "What did I say, brat? I told you not to move, didn't I?" he said, sending a cold chill down into his sternum. Lenny peered at him, resting his art on his chest. "You don't own me, you can make threats, but when Dad gets home, I'll tell him everything," he replied, hoping to ignore him, but his brother crept in further and put his face against his. "You little asshole, I could have set you free, but you think you know it all. You don't know anything, twerp," he said, trawling his fingers against his other hand until it was deeply gouged, leaving fresh fingernail marks. He spun back towards the door, leaving him, ominously walking out of the room, leaving his brother to question it, but just for a split second. Lenny studied the road ahead, putting his mind into the past, zeroing in on past encounters with his brother. It wasn't much more than a week after that incident, when Martin attempted once again to get him into the garage. Their father again was away. A fire call, not far from where they lived, no more than 3 blocks from their home, 222 Hopper Street. A family of 4 had been asleep when it happened. Investigations went cold after about 6 months, and that was the last he had heard of it, until this moment thinking about it. A sick infant and his mother had perished, leaving the downtrodden father and eldest boy homeless. It was known as the second great tragedy within the community of Evergreen Valley, not taking in the national account of the missing teenage boy, who to this day's remains had never turned up in the Mount Peel Mountains. Other accounts of missing hikers, hunters and nature seekers had gone there to never return back to humanity also. All this time and still nothing worth writing home about had surfaced, except for a few torn pieces of clothing and some busted camping gear that some believed to be left behind, nothing more than vacationing remnants left on location. The buzz led a sizable group of forensic specialists to analyze the woodland, once known to be sacred to the Indians, which caused a stir, breaking a noticeable wind around town during them years. Witnesses began to come forward, and then for whatever reason the news that once ravished the trying town had become second-hand worries, forgotten of. The unusual news had come and gone quite rapidly, and in the end, turning the town's growing reputation stale for the most part. Foreclosure after foreclosure began to build an infallible void there. Lenny thought about it, holding the wheel, picturing their father reading silently at the table like he did. His strong black coffee in front of him and his lucky strikes. He could see him now, with his greased hair, slicked tight of Bryle cream. He read the paper like that each morning, hands still stained of work, fighting ash and smolder, then those hours he went at it in his study, the garage. Where old Stacy sit, either on stands or raised on blocks. Stacy was the queen and he was the king. Stacy was his newest project, that's what he'd named her. Her heavy steel hood opened, emptied tram or motor oil cans sitting at her side. Their father would forge a bond working on her like a workhorse. His hands bleed of rust and metal, he couldn't remember a time they hadn't. It was that particular night, not far from midnight when their father hurried to the station. He recalled being fast asleep, dreaming of something, what it meant, what it appeared as to him, he was unsure and fighting to understand, but dreams were never as easy as seeing it first thing, that would be just too easy. He studied it, with his eyes moving from one corner to the next, slumbering fast against his bed, eyes shut. It became quite vivid. He stood against the earth gawking at the growing vortex of squiggly, captivating colors, high above him and 100 feet out in the distance from where he stood. The sky had somehow opened above, enthralling and unworldly as it spun above. His hands trembled nervously at the sight of it, peering at it anxiously. He fought hard to run away. The earth below him began to grumble, sending rock and debris wildly into him. The once steady wind surrounding him suddenly sprung into action, sweeping against the ground until it carried everything in its path. It was now pummeling into his weakening arms, tirelessly. He held tight against a lone stump, one that had fallen years before, in another long, lost forgotten dream. His eyes were stuck fast to it, with his body quivering below. Above him a storm of horns began skewering through the sky of many shades. He glared at it again, desperately holding himself tight against the wood. The wind howled surrounding him, crying and thrusting against the surface as he watched the orb of light raise above all of Earth. His fear had manifested into something much darker as he clung on to the tree fighting the dreadful monsoon around him. Although, something inside pleaded for him to shut his eyes, he just couldn't bear to. Without hesitation, the distant sound of wailing children began to resonate, surrounding the night sky, bellowing and strumming from the hills to the heavens. His arms wrapped against the rotten stub, he continued to glare in through the swirling atmosphere with a life of its own. As he peered, concentrating into the freakish rapture he felt abandoned, powerless against it. The fear growing inside in him had finally paralyzed him from the waist down. He was numb, unable to counter its attacks. His legs had blown back and were dangling in the strong wind. He turned his eyes towards them and back to the beast, unable to balance his weight. He felt his body against its force, weightless and ungrounded as if there were no barriers now, only the aftermath of what would be left. If there were to be anything left behind. His bones were cold, as he fought back, holding the wood. He was a feather in its hold, a piece of litter that had been swept up into its windstorm. Suddenly, his eyes began to swell, watching the sphere, where a set of cowering horns, appearing of gold and bronze and a freakish face had unexplainably peeked out into the world around him, ascending into the squall before him. A terrible grueling, hateful complexion it had as it rolled its marble-like eyes towards him, a face that said everything, its jagged teeth glistening against the harsh wind, cringing of total distaste for human life and what it represented, a growing disgust for mankind, a hatred for love or kindness and a even darker hatred for life. Discernment and pure evil had in whatever way, lingered out from the vortex. The hollow in its blackened eyes was something much, much darker. Those pitted eyes, where living life could not go, there was no such light for it, not of human magnitude and not of this realm. He held on, slipping against the crumbling soil, until a massive pair of god-awful, clawed, Thorn-filled hands began to reach out from the bottomless crevice, immediately tightening itself into a fist of deadly horseflies. It was that of a demonic realm, and it was there, and was for whatever reason. Whatever it was, whatever had come, its evil, its endeavors were larger than any man, and much more vast than hell. He gripped the wheel. Martin was still in a slumber against the door. The night was darker now than earlier, much darker. He picked apart his thoughts, putting everything into that moment, thinking further than he thought possible. He clung to the stump, peering up at the face, that forbidding grin, its teeth grinding towards his. His eyes burning against the strong wind hitting him, he clenched the wood as if nothing could take him from it. "What are you? Go back to the depths of hell where you belong," he hollered, with his fingers slightly slipping. "I won't go, you can't and will not take me with you," he shrieked, noticing the flies swarming out from it. There were billions of them rippling noisily above him, maybe trillions of them as they devoured the space above. Its face suddenly groaned at him, a powerful groan that caused the land below to sway and crumble, prying its eyelids apart as it slid towards him from the sphere, shoving its tongue out, spraying him with sopping wetness. He tightened his face underneath, holding himself in the wind, until it roared once more, "You are mine. You're my forever slave. There is no releasing what belongs to me, Lenny. Your life has been signed, and in blood there is no escape, only the paining cries and whimpering of the dead." He held the steering wheel, noticing Martin moving beside him. "Mart, get up, are we getting close?" he asked him, with his mind still wandering. Chapter 12, Crosswired. "We're now in endangered territory, little brother," his older brother said, slowly sitting up against the upholstery. "Take a swift look at that sunset, Len, reminds me of a distant childhood, all of those times we spent treasure hunting Great Ole Mount Peel. I sure miss our hometown. Back home nothing seemed to matter, other than Dad and us, a fixing of poached eggs and burnt toast on Saturday morning, and crawling out of bed at dawnbreak to rummage the hills of the gods," he said, sounding of high spirits. Lenny nodded, and lifted the visor to where the sunlight reflected from the windshield. "Gods? Endangered, why is that? You said it wasn't far, but we've been on the open road for hours now, all night to be exact," he said, slowing down. Across from them a street sign read in crisp lettering, "Navajo Lake. Take a left and go straight until the road separates into a fork, then take another left and we're there," Martin said, directing him. They pulled off from the highway and onto a stone driveway. Lenny gawked at the trees surrounding them, where the woodland reminded him of home. "It has its charm, doesn't it?" he said, thinking his brother would agree, and it did. He continued to drive, taking in the view. "It's why I picked it, there isn't another lake like this for a million miles," his brother responded. He was also studying the landscape. "This one has a tidbit of mischievousness to it, a little mystery if I may say so. You will see what I mean when we trek further," he added, peering out at the sparkling water. Lenny stared at the fork in the road and turned, remembering something from an old movie he had seen. Each turn represented something, he didn't recall what it was or what it meant, but it wasn't good. "This is it, Lenny, Navajo Lake. I've heard things about this place. Spending time with Father, I've learned a few things, valuable things," his brother said, reaching down for a canteen filled of spring water. "Do you need a drink? It's been a good drive, but we're here and this is where the fun begins," he said, glaring at his other half. "Nah, I'm alright for now, I'm not much of a water drinker anyways," he replied, pulling the car into a small parking area just a few yards off from the water. The shallow lake was glinting underneath the clouds. There were 2 houseboats neighboring them and a lodging structure in the distance. Lenny stared at them a short while and then back at Martin. "It must be nice," he said, squinting his eyes in the sunlit parking lot. "What is?" his brother replied, taking a swift gulp of spring water. The animal blood on his face had absorbed since earlier, he appeared parched. The brothers sat a while together, peering out into the vast opening of resource. "It must be nice," I said, Having things, nice things, he said again, finally pulling the door hitch. Alright, you got me up here, I'd like to get it over with, and get back before sundown, he uttered, watching his brother as he exited the car. Lenny, don't be in such a hurry, you're no longer the twerp who used to rat on me to Dad, so I want this to be a bonding moment for us both. You know, I could have kept all of this to myself, but you are my only brother, and that, I won't take lightly, he muttered towards him, standing at the other end. They paused a swift second, listening to the water wrinkle against the sand and then back out. You know, this is the first time we have done something like this since that day, Lenny said, suddenly noticing his brother walking ahead and stopping abruptly at the water. Since when? Martin replied, kneeling at the edge where the water met the sand and stone. His boots were barely touching it as it washed towards him and slowly retracted. He touched it, feeling it. You would think this time of year it wouldn't be so frigid, he said, again standing, but this time facing him. The boy in the woods, I haven't really thought about it in such a time. There's something about this place, I can't say I haven't thought a lot about it, I have, just haven't in such a long while, he said, shutting the door. Len, forget it, there isn't much to tell, you know, I vowed I'd keep that to myself then and I still have to, it's really not up to me anymore, he said. Lenny glared at him, confused, unsure of what he meant. I have something even bigger than that. If you really want to see something, witness something like this, that will leave you speechless, forget that shit buck back there, forget that I'm a fuck up, forget all of that dumb shit, forget I spent time caged up like a fucking shit for nothing with no real hope of fitting in with humanity. I have something larger than life or death to share with you, little brother, something unworldly, he said, approaching him at the car. Well, I'm trying, Mart. It isn't easy to see you like this, it's been a while and we haven't always been that connected, not in the way we see things, his brother said, still leaning against the car. Here is to a fresh start, something new, a new adventure for the both of us, come on, don't shilly-shally. It's a pretty lengthy hike, he said, replying to him. Alright, Mart, but what about the shovels and limestone? He said. Martin paused a swift moment and shook his head. Don't worry about it, we will get it later, he uttered, waving him over. That pathway way out there is where we're heading, he said, raising his hand towards its direction. It's dense and heavily wooded, might have a bit of trouble getting through, but once we're in, there's a clearing for us to gather ourselves and that's where we will rest a bit before moving on, he added, holding the water close to his mouth. I have the lighter if we need to make a fire, we can kill us a rogue skunk or a groundhog or something, eat what the land provides us, Martin said, gawking awkwardly at him. Ah, I think I'll be alright, I'm not the hunter you are, and I really don't eat wild game anymore, anyways, that gamey taste makes me want to upchuck every time, he said, looking at him. You know, there is supermarkets for things like that nowadays, where they sell meat, not the kind out here, but you know what I'm getting at, he said, although his stomach felt empty. His brother didn't respond, listening to him from where he stood. You really do enjoy that kind of thing? You always were the regular Indiana Jones, the true explorer, he said, chuckling at him, but his brother didn't seem as enthusiastic as he stood quiet. He finally broke the silence. You're letting me down, I know you're not deliberately trying to. But it hurts, you know, he said, with both of his hands at each side. Chapter 12, Trails. A moment passed over as they stood together underneath the bright sunlight. Come, I'll show you what you're probably wondering most about, why your jailbird, good-for-nothing brother brought you all the way to the southern side of humanity, huh? Well, come on, we're not getting any younger standing around, he said, leading him. Both of them began trudging towards the outer end of the lake, towards the overgrown greenwood. A pathway led inside, a narrow pathway, it was probably the width of small child, possibly a foot on each end, from left to right, maybe less. So, tell me what it was like? Lenny questioned him at his side as they neared the opening. His brother was hurrying as he fought to keep up, it was the same as if they were still kids playing in the woods. He was always the quicker, much more aggressive hiker. What? What are you concerned about that for? You know it's nothing. I've been there how many times since Dad died, you know, he said, just ahead of him. He sounded comprehensive, keeping things short. You know Dad would have wanted something much different for you. Shit, even I. Well, for the both us, he wanted the best for us. What happened? Do you ever wonder what things would have been like if he was still in our ears telling us what he thought, and what not to do all the time like when we were little? He asked him, stopping him ahead. Martin spun towards him and nodded softly. I sure do. Isn't a moment that passes without that thought, he said, peering at him between the trees. I'm not exactly a protege or a carbon copy of sorts of what he would have expected for an outcome, but I think in some way, all dads understand, by nagging us half to death it's only another uncongenial method of teaching us to better ourselves, he said, wiping the sweat from his face, where remnants of deer's blood had dried over the last hour or so. Lenny shook his head. You're right. What is perfection? Live to stay alive, breathe it in, exhale and let the world die as it will around us, shit when you need to shit and sleep when you need to rest, eat, fuck, work, sleep, shit, repeat, repeat. That about sums shit up, you know, he said, as the two burst into laughter together. You're twisted as they come, little brother, he replied, with a half smile. Still, I don't believe any of it, he said, kicking an acorn from the path in front of them. Lenny chuckled, following him again. Hey now, you don't know much about me. It has been a while and you were in the pokey a good deal. I've done some shit, taking a few for the team, some I'm not typically proud for, but I did, and that's living, especially by the standards I mentioned, he said, sounding silly and embarrassed. His brother continued into the woodland, leading him deeper. I'll make a note of it, he said, replying to him from ahead. Time is wasting. We need to make ground if we're to get there before nightfall, he said, hurrying, hitting branches as he hiked ahead. Lenny stared at the trees as he followed pursuit of his brother, reminding him of a childhood that seemed long forgotten of. You're still the rocket walker, I remember. Doesn't matter how old we get, I'm sure you will always outdo me, always did, and don't tell me it's because I'm your little brother, he said, almost chasing him at this point. He turned a split moment at him. You're still a small fry in my book, come on, I'm not carrying you if you fall over now, he shouted back at him, from ahead. Lenny gawked at him, not sure of why, but feeling as if there was more to their journey than just the norm, but what it was still as mysterious as the woods he found himself in. You should have brought in the water from the car, I should have warned you, this isn't exactly a picnic out here, his brother hollered from afar. Lenny watched him, nearing him as they patrolled the woods. What is it then, if it's no picnic? Do you feel like letting me in on the big secret? He replied, noticing how quickly he found himself lost, and out of his usual comfort zone, and in a strange place. I hope you don't find a way to lose us out here. I would like to find civilization before it gets too dark to see anything, he said, sounding concerned. Martin was pushing deeper and beginning to fade in the distance. It's not far from here, just try to keep up, Len. This is worth every cent of everything you've ever wanted, I promise. His brother shrieked. Okay, I'm in it this far, can we at least take a moment to breath? My body isn't what it was when we were little, he responded. Martin ignored him, making it hard for him to see him now. Lenny continued to hike. The ground had gotten rocky underneath him. His legs felt numb, and he now felt regretful for neglecting himself for not taking the water. He pushed on, ignoring the thought of it, studying the woods ahead. Do you want to wait up for me? I mean, I'm not trying to be a stick in the mud. But damn it, Martin, you're losing me out here. Feeling frustrated, he shouted loudly for him to hear him. He was now unable to see him from ahead, where the trees draped, covering them in darkness. Chapter 14, Greet and Meet. He could suddenly hear something, a distinct noise. It was nearing him from ahead. He stared silently a moment, listening for it, to see it, but then it stopped short, from behind the trees. Again, he crept further towards the furthest part of the woodland, where his brother had lost him along the narrow trail. Again, the weird squeaky noise squeaked concurrently from behind, the sound of rust and bearings, and a light panting came towards him in the shade as he fought through the forest. "Martin, is that you? Man, this is the oldest trick in the Book of Martin, you can't scare me," Buttle he hollered, listening to it. It was growing as it came towards him, now standing in place along the gravel. Acorns and broken twigs covered the pathway as he stepped to the side, hiding along the path for his brother to jump out. A split second later, the sound of bearings startled him as he closed his eyes awaiting the immaturity of his older brother. "Hey there," cried a gentle voice, panting slightly, where the corroded sound of bearing came to an abrupt stop a foot from him along the weeds. He quickly opened his eyes, realizing it want him. In a way, he felt almost delightful that it want. "Hey, have you seen my brother? He left me in the dust and just when it all settled I found myself out here alone. He's a super nut when it comes to hiking. Did you see anyone up ahead?" he asked, questioning her, but her expression said it all. He didn't have to ask her anything else. "Sure haven't, I just bring my little guy up here. It's a good workout and the nature is splendid. The ground isn't exactly a roller rink but this stroller gets through it pretty good. It's why my husband purchased the one with the bigger wheels, so stay-home mothers like me can go baby hiking and lose some baby fat," she said, making small talk. The little boy in the stroller was cooing, and staring at a gray squirrel as it sprung from the leaves along the ground onto one of the trees close to them. "I actually have to, but my oldest is in school right now. Her name's Brooklyn," she said, noticing he was still observing the woods ahead. "To answer your question, I haven't seen anyone to tell you the truth," she said, quickly handing the infant a sippy cup half filled with watered-down juice. "Do you come out here much?" she asked him, sounding curious. He looked at her and then back at the stroller. "You may want to put some oil on them ball bearings. I heard you coming from a mile away, and no, this is a first for me. My brother had some big surprise for me but I'm still wondering if it was worth dragging my butt out here," he added, peering at her. "It just started making all that racket. I think something along the path got stuck in it or something. It's pretty new, we only had it since the baby shower," she said, taking the cup from him. "I see. Well, if you see a tall, strange man who is wearing a white t-shirt and a leather jacket, that would be my brother. Could you give him a swift kick in the butt if you see him and thank him for leaving me out here," he said, smirking, reaching to give her a welcoming handshake. "It was nice meeting you. Anyways, I do have to find him, or it's going to be a hell of a hike home for me," he said, staring at her. "I sure will. I'll send him in your direction if I see anyone who fits that description. It was nice meeting you. Maybe we will run into each other again out here," she replied, immediately lifting the heavy stroller over a patch of earth that had broke, where roots came through and were now growing wildly. "I'd appreciate that. Good luck with your little guy. The path gets tighter down a ways, and maybe we will, who knows, maybe he will talk me into it again, but I do have my assumptions that this will be the only time for me," he said, smiling at her. "See you later. Good talking to you," she replied, waving to him before jogging away. She began slowly sprinting behind the stroller as she pushed the infant, as he watched in the near distance. She made it halfway into the trees before immediately hesitating, parking the noisy stroller and the infant to the side of the path. She peered back at him, with a discerned expression across her face. "Oh shoot, this isn't good. It appears I must have dropped my purse, and my keys are in there so it can't leave it," she hollered from afar, and gripped the stroller again, briskly wheeling it in his direction before pulling it up beside him in the grass. "Really? Well, it looks as if you might need to backtrack and I'm sure it couldn't have fallen far from the path, unless you have something the critters out here might want as food," he said, attempting to reassure her. She glared in the opposite direction of them, where Martin had went on ahead. I wouldn't say food, but there was some dry cereal for my son in there, maybe a stick of gum also, not sure if that is enough to attract something. I guess we will see, she complied with him, before they turned together, heading into the darker section of the woods where she came out from. Do you mind if we walk together? She asked him. He responded by shrugging his shoulders and shaking his head. That sounds alright, I'm out here alone also, thanks to my brother. He's a butthead, he's done this since we were little, might actually make more sense searching for it together, he said, as they left for the tree land ahead. I'll introduce you to Marin if we see him, but let me forewarn you, he isn't as well-mannered as I am, he said, sounding confident. Okay, I still can't believe I did this. I really don't have much time before Brooklyn gets home from school. I'm sure she will wait outside until I get back. My husband had a lot to drink the other night, I'm not too sure he will hear her knocking, she said, sounding dismal. He peered at her a short second. No, you will get home in time, it can't be far, not if you haven't run into Martin, he's a regular rocket foot, hikes through trails like his pants are on fire, he said, responding towards her. If you dropped it, or if it fell from your son's carriage, he would have brought it back already. I'd say it couldn't be too far, not with him out here, he said, trying to persuade her. They hiked further out. The infant riding in the carriage began to snivel, the white of his eyes were reddened as if he had allergies. He was holding his face and grabbing the tray in front of him, he was having a temper tantrum. He's tired, and probably hungry by now, she said, pushing him. Lenny stared at the small child and smiled. He's not alone, I'd die for a Texas-style sirloin steak right now, he said, jokingly. Maybe a blooming onion and some home fries also, he added, trying to cheer her up, but she wasn't having it. Her face was pointed at the ground for the lost purse. She then turned up at him, walking to her side, and scoffed, well, little mister here is only a few months old, he doesn't have teeth for all that just yet. Give it a while and I bet he will be daydreaming of the same things, she said, trying not to sound rushed, but she was. He's been teething, that could be another reason he's grabby, she said, smirking. I'd be cranky and fitting too if I was him, that can't feel too good, he replied, also watching the dirt ahead for the misplaced purse. The lake management hasn't kept up much with the upkeep out here. Then again, we had that storm a few nights ago, he said, suddenly watching for his brother. Martin? Are you out here? Don't be a stupid jerk and hide, you brought me out here, what's up with that? He shouted, immediately hearing the sound of his own voice barreling back at him, echoing in the wild. It doesn't look good, does it? Do you think he turned back and went another route? Maybe he's looking for you elsewhere, she said, carefully listening for him to get a response. There is other paths that lead back, but they are mostly man-made. Also, when the lake floods, the water's known to rise, tunneling through here as if it has a mind of its own, she said, poking around in the dirt with her hands. Haven't seen it yet, have you? He asked her, realizing the ground appeared untouched. I think if we keep moving we will find it wherever it had slipped off, he said, hiking ahead. This ground is unstable, it wouldn't take much for it to come off, just like them noisy bearings, he said, trudging his way through the narrowing weeds. No purse, no keys, all of these woods look the same, it's hard to say how far we are. I made it to the clearing about an hour ago, might be there, I don't know, she said, her face appeared displeased with the results.